A single act of kindness changed everything. One rescue, one second chance. One unexpected love. Have you ever experienced that? Share your thoughts below, and hit subscribe to join us for the next story. The sound was deafening. A metal scream ripping through the morning air. As a steel beam plummeted from the upper levels of the grand horizon, sight in an instant, glass shattered. Concrete dust filled the street, and the sleek black car parked along the curb twisted under the crushing weight. Inside, Victoria Hale, CEO of Hale Development, and one of the most powerful women in Chicago, found herself pinned by the collapsed frame. Her breath shallow, her body trapped in the wreckage. Time seemed to fracture. The world that had always been to her suddenly felt fragile, slipping out of her control. Through the haze of pain and panic, she caught the blurred image of movement. Boots pounding the ground, a figure cutting through the chaos with desperate purpose. Daniel Cole didn't stop to think. Instinct took over. The same instinct that had carried him through countless dangerous moments on construction sites, sharpened by years of raising a child alone. His hands rough with reached through jagged glass, steady but urgent. "I've got you," he murmured, his voice low, almost drowned by the sirens in the distance. With strength that belied his lean frame, he pried open the crumpled door and pulled her free. Every motion laced with both determination and surprising gentleness. Victoria collapsed against the pavement, dazed, clutching at the sudden rush of air. For the first time in years, she wasn't the master of her world. She was just a woman who had nearly died, staring up at the man who had saved her. His face was shadowed beneath a hard hat, his dark hair damp with sweat, eyes focused on her with an intensity that made her chest tighten. Before she could form a word, he slipped a worn jacket off his shoulders and wrapped it around her trembling frame. Then, just as quickly, he was gone. By the time paramedics arrived, the stranger had vanished into the growing crowd of workers and bystanders, leaving only the faint trace of grit and the weight of his jacket heavy on her shoulders. Reporters would later clamor for her statement. Board members would insist she take time off. But Victoria found herself haunted, not by the accident itself, but by him. Who was the man who had risked his life, without hesitation, only to disappear without waiting for gratitude or recognition? As she sat on the curb, beside the twisted metal that had nearly claimed her life, Victoria clutched the jacket closer, as though it were armor. Her empire had been built on deals, contracts, and careful calculations. But this was something she couldn't quantify. In a city where every relationship carried a price, a stranger had given her back her life and asked for nothing in return. That question would follow her in the days to come, creeping into her thoughts at night, echoing in the silence of her high-rise office. Why had he saved her? And more unsettling, why had he walked away? The city never paused, not even after a near tragedy. While Victoria Hale sat in her glass tower, haunted by the memory of a faceless rescuer, that same man was already awake before Forden. Moving quietly through a small apartment in Riverside, one of Chicago's working-class neighborhoods, tucked between rusted train tracks and rows of aging brick buildings, Daniel Cole's alarm buzzed early. He silenced it quickly, careful not to wake the little girl sleeping in the next room. For a moment he stood in the narrow canopy, listening to the soft rhythm of her breathing. That sound meant more to him than any paycheck, more than any recognition he'd ever received. It was the heartbeat of his world. He showered fast, brewed a pot of bitter coffee, and packed a simple lunch. 2 sandwiches wrapped in foil, an apple, and a cookie he'd saved from yesterday's dinner. Only then did he tiptoe into Sophie's room. The walls were plastered with her drawings, rockets made of cardboard, houses with crooked roofs, rainbows with too many colors. Crayons rolled across the floor, where she had left them, after falling asleep, mid-sketch. Gently, Daniel brushed a strand of dark hair from her forehead and whispered, "Time to rise and shine, sunshine." Her eyelids fluttered open, and she gave him a sleepy smile, the kind that melted away every burden he carried. She stretched her arms toward him, and he scooped her up, marveling again at how light she felt and how heavy the responsibility of being her only parent truly was. Breakfast was never fancy. a box of cereal, a splash of milk, and sometimes eggs, if the budget stretched that week. Sophie had a habit of arranging her cereal into patterns, tiny rows and circles, before eating them one by one. Daniel never interrupted. It was her way of bringing order into a world that had once been shaken by loss. Years earlier, her mother had walked out, saying she wasn't cut out for the life they had built, leaving behind nothing but silence. Daniel had filled that silence with stories, projects, and endless devotion to his little girl. At their tiny kitchen table, sunlight streamed through blinds that never quite closed properly. Daniel sipped his coffee, black rough hands wrapped around the chipped mug, while Sophie chatted about her teacher and the class hamster. He listened, really listened, nodding at every detail, as her words were the most important news of the day. To him they were. When breakfast ended, he slipped Sophie's homework into her backpack and helped her tie the laces of her shoes, already fraying at the edges. She insisted on wearing the mismatched socks she loved, one with stars, one with stripes, and he didn't argue. Let the world see her spirit, he thought. Before heading to the site, Daniel dropped Sophie at Margaret O'Connor's apartment, one floor below. Margaret, 72, had become their anchor, a widow who had seen her share of hardship. She opened her door each morning with a smile for Sophie and a watchful eye for Daniel. "You look tired again," she told him, her voice soft but edged with concern. He nodded, brushing it off, though she saw more than he admitted. Life in Riverside wasn't easy. Thin walls, broken elevators, paychecks stretched to their breaking point. But it was steady, it was home. It was where Daniel poured everything he had into raising Sophie. As he kissed Sophie's cheek goodbye and stepped out into the chill of morning, Daniel carried the memory of yesterday's rescue with him like a shadow. He hadn't told anyone, not Margaret, not the other workers at the site. To him, it wasn't a story about heroism. It was simply what a man should do. But as he adjusted his hard hat and walked toward another day of labor, he couldn't know that the woman whose life he saved was searching for him still, and that their worlds were already on a path to collide again, while Daniel Cole disappeared into the rhythm of Riverside mornings. Across the city, Victoria Hale sat in her 32nd floor office, the bruises from the accident still hidden beneath a tailored suit. The skyline of Chicago stretched before her, glass, steel, and towers that bore her name. Yet for the first time in years, she found no comfort in their shine. Every reflection in the window carried the ghost of a stranger's face, calloused hands pulling her from twisted steel, a worn jacket wrapping around her like armor, eyes that held no demand for recognition. He had vanished before she could even speak his name. Hale Development was under pressure. The Grand Horizon project, her most ambitious tower, that had investors nervous. The board murmured about her return to work. Too quickly the press circled with speculation. And beneath it all, whispers of sabotage began to ripple through the industry. But Victoria's focus, though sharpened by crisis, was split. Alongside balance sheets and boardroom battles, she carried an obsession: finding the man who had saved her life. Her assistant, Robert Collins, placed reports on her desk with quiet efficiency. Security is combing through the footage from the site, but visibility was limited. Too much debris, too many barriers. We don't have a clear image of him yet. Victoria's green eyes lifted, steady and unyielding, then widened. The search: employee records, subcontractors, anyone with access to the site that day. "He's out there, Robert, and I intend to find him." Robert hesitated, then lowered his voice. "The board would prefer you focus on stabilizing Grand Horizon. There's talk Marcus Bennett has been meeting with rival developers." The sound of that name. A shadow flickered across Victoria's face. Marcus, her ex-husband, was once her partner in both business and ambition. Together they had built Hale Development, from a small consultancy into a powerhouse. But Marcus had never been satisfied with integrity. He had cut corners, bribed inspectors, and when she confronted him, the marriage crumbled. The divorce had been public, bitter, and costly. Marcus had sworn revenge, promising to dismantle everything she had built. Victoria closed the report, her expression sharpening. "Marcus has been quiet too long. If he's circling, then I'll be ready." She rose from her chair, crossing to the window from this height. The streets below looked small, insignificant, but she knew better. Somewhere down there in the dust and grit, walked the man who had reached into wreckage for her. Without hesitation. A construction worker, perhaps. Maybe just another name on a payroll she'd never memorized. Yet he had changed everything in a single heartbeat. She pressed her palm against the glass. In her world, every relationship was transactional. Loyalty could be bought, success measured in profit margins, and allies turned overnight into enemies. But he had shattered that logic by giving her something priceless, without ever asking in return. And it had unsettled her more than she cared to admit. Behind her, Robert cleared his throat. "Do you want me to offer a reward? Something substantial might draw him out." Victoria turned, her jaw set. "Yes. $20,000. Announce it quietly. Safety review, employee recognition. However you need to frame it. But make sure the message is clear. The man who saved me will not go unnoticed." As Robert nodded and left, Victoria sank back into her chair, exhaustion pressing against her bones. Her empire was under siege, her past clawing at her future. And yet, what consumed her thoughts was not Marcus Bennett's schemes, nor the looming board vote. It was the memory of strong arms, lifting her from fire and steel, then letting her go without a name. That night alone in her penthouse, she traced the outline of her grandmother's bracelet, the one she had lost in the crash. She wondered if it lay somewhere in the rubble, or impossibly, had been carried away in the pocket of the man she saw. Either way, she knew with a clarity that startled her, she would not rest until she found him. Not just to thank him, but to understand why someone in a city built on ambition and deals would risk everything for nothing at all. Saturday mornings had always been sacred for Daniel. Call, no overtime, no construction noise, no rushing against deadlines. Just a father and his daughter at Riverside Park, where Sophie could swing, climb and conquer the world, while he sat on the worn wooden bench, coffee in hand, keeping watch. It was their ritual, a small island of peace in a life built on sacrifice. On this particular morning, Sophie hung upside down from the monkey bars, braids dangling, her laughter ringing across the playground. "Look, Daddy, I'm a bat," she shouted. Daniel chuckled, raising a thumb in her direction. "Careful, sunshine, don't fall." His voice carried that mix of pride and constant vigilance that only a single parent knows. He was so focused on her that he didn't notice the woman approaching until she spoke. "She's fearless." Daniel turned, surprised there. There, standing a few feet away, was Victoria Hay. Not in her severe suits or designer heels, but in jeans and a simple blouse, her hair loose around her shoulders. For a moment he almost didn't recognize her. Yet her presence carried the same quiet authority, softened now by something unfamiliar. "Miss Hale," he said, straightening slightly. "What are you doing here?" She gestured vaguely toward the walking path. "I live nearby. Sometimes I come here on weekends. It clears my head." She glanced at Sophie, still dangling happily. "She's wonderful." Daniel's gaze followed his daughter, and his tone was simple, unguarded. "She's everything." Victoria hesitated, then sat at the far end of the bench, careful not to intrude too close. "It's a beautiful park. I don't come often enough." Silence stretched between them. Daniel wondered if she knew, if she had pieced together, that he was the man from the accident, the one who had pulled her out of twisted steel. Her eyes searched his face, though, trying to confirm something her memory couldn't quite grasp. Before either could speak again, Sophie scrambled across the grass and stopped in front of Victoria, cheeks flushed from play. "Hi, are you Daddy's friend?" she asked without a trace of shyness. Victoria smiled, taken aback by the child's openness. "Hello, Sophie, I'm Victoria." Sophie tilted her head. "Do you build buildings too?" "Daddy builds everything. He fixed Mrs. O'Connor's sink and made me a bookshelf for my birthday. He can fix anything." Her voice brimmed with pride, the kind only a child could give so freely. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. Sophie, but Victoria's expression softened. She crouched down to meet the girl's eyes. "That's impressive. You're lucky to have him." Sophie grinned widely. "I know he's the best." Then she spotted the ice cream truck near the fountain and gasped. "Daddy, can I have one, please?" Daniel checked his watch, then sighed with mock sternness. "Before lunch, you're bargaining hard, sunshine." She clasped her hands dramatically, drawing out the word into 4 pleading syllables. he laughed, a warm sound that startled Victoria with its sincerity. All right, but just a small one. He handed her a few dollars. Get me a strawberry popsicle if they have it. Sophie darted off, leaving them in an unexpected stillness. Victoria glanced at Daniel, then spoke quietly. She adores you. Daniel looked down, his voice steady. She's all I have. I try to give her enough love for two. For a moment, something flickered across Victoria's face. Recognition, perhaps, or longing. Watching this man with his daughter, hearing the simplicity in his words, she felt an ache she hadn't allowed herself in years. In her world, affection was measured, guarded, often bartered for gain. But here, in a park filled with laughter and sunlight, she was reminded that some bonds were built on nothing more than love, freely given. Sophie returned proudly, holding 3 dripping treats. I got one for you too, Victoria. Vanilla, because everyone likes vanilla. Victoria accepted it with a startled laugh. Thank you, sweetheart. As the 3 of them sat together, Daniel quietly watchful, Sophie chattering between bites, and Victoria listening with a smile she hadn't worn in years. Something shifted. It wasn't business or obligation or calculation. It was simple, unguarded humanity. It left Victoria with a question she couldn't escape. Had she just stumbled upon the man who had saved her life? Or had she, without realizing, stepped into the beginning of something that might save her heart? The knock came just after sunset. Daniel Cole had just finished cleaning up the dinner dishes, the smell of tomato soup still lingering in the air. Sophie sat cross-legged on the living room rug, coloring a cardboard rocket ship she and her father had been building together all week. He wasn't expecting anyone. Mrs. O'Connor rarely visited this late, and most of the neighbors kept to themselves. When he opened the door, surprise washed over his face. Standing in the dimly lit hallway was Victoria Hale. She wore a simple navy dress, elegant yet understated. Her presence so out of place against the cracked paint and narrow corridor of the riverside apartments that, for a moment, Daniel thought he must be imagining her. Miss Hale, he said carefully, lowering his voice so Sophie wouldn't hear. This is unexpected. I'm sorry to intrude, Victoria replied, her tone softer than he had ever heard it. But I needed to see you. May I come in? He hesitated, then stepped aside. She entered slowly, her sharp eyes taking in the modest space. The shelves lined with Sophie's drawings, the well-worn furniture, the stack of library books on the coffee table. It wasn't much, but it was a home built with love. Sophie looked up, her face lighting instantly. Victoria, did you come to see my rocket ship? She ran over, tugging eagerly at the woman's hand. Victoria smiled, kneeling down so she was eye-level with the child. I'd love to for the next few minutes. She listened intently as Sophie explained every glitter-covered detail of the cardboard creation. Daniel watched from the kitchen doorway, uneasy at first, then slowly disarmed by the genuine warmth in Victoria's expression. When Sophie finally returned to her coloring, Victoria rose and faced him. I know it was you, she said simply. The accident, you pulled me out of that car. Daniel's jaw tightened. He said nothing, only crossed his arms, as though bracing for what would come next. I've been searching for you, Feng. She continued to thank you, to offer something in return. Anything you need. Education, housing, even a college fund for Sophie. You risked your life for me. Let me do something for you. Her words hung in the air, heavy with sincerity. But Daniel shook his head, his voice steady. No, that day wasn't a transaction. It wasn't about favors or rewards. You were in danger and I did what anyone should do. That's it. Victoria blinked, unused to being refused. But surely no, he said again, softer this time. I won't let Sophie grow up thinking kindness has a price tag. What I did, it was the right thing, nothing more. Silence filled the room, broken only by the scratch of Sophie's crayons on cardboard. Victoria turned slightly, watching the child's concentration. The quiet way Daniel moved around her, steady as gravity. Something in her chest tightened. In her world, gratitude was usually measured in contracts and zeros at the end of checks. Here in this small apartment, it was measured in love, so simple and unguarded that it unsettled her. She drew in a breath. Then let me at least say thank you properly. Not as a CEO, not with money, just as a woman whose life you saved. Daniel met her gaze, and for the first time his expression softened. "Thank you," he said. And the words, though small, carried a weight she felt deep in her bones. In that fragile pause something shifted. An invisible thread, pulling their two worlds just slightly closer. It wasn't a grand promise, not yet. But it was a beginning, fragile and uncertain. Held together by a child's laughter and the echo of a rescue neither of them could forget. The fragile thread that had begun to connect Victoria and Daniel was tested sooner than either of them expected, while she was still grappling with gratitude and the unexpected calm she found in that small riverside apartment. Another storm was gathering, one carefully orchestrated by a man who knew her better than most. Marcus Bennett had been silent for months, but silence from Marcus was never safety. It was strategy. The first strike came through the press. Headlines whispered of financial instability at Hale Development. Anonymous sources claimed the Grand Horizon project was behind schedule, over budget and teetering on collapse. Investors, always quick to react to rumor, began to call nervously. Victoria recognized Marcus' hand immediately. He had always known how perception could wound more deeply than fact. But Marcus's schemes didn't stop with Wall Street. Whispers his eyes had shifted toward Riverside. The working-class neighborhood Daniel and Sophie called home. Behind layers of shell companies, he began buying up properties block by block. To the casual observer, it looked like routine development. To those living there, it quickly became a siege. Margaret O'Connor noticed first. A man in a press suit knocked at her door one afternoon, offering cash for her apartment. "The building's old," he said smoothly. "Wouldn't you rather downsize before the maintenance becomes too much?" When she refused, the tone shifted. Subtle warnings about rising costs, about renovations that might make her unit less suitable for someone her age. Margaret closed the door with shaking hands. But the unease lingered. Soon, other neighbors had stories of similar encounters. Shop owners whispered about leases being threatened, about mysterious inspections suddenly appearing. What had been a stable, if modest community began to feel fragile, like glass under pressure. Daniel saw it in Margaret's face when she brought Sophie back from school one evening. Her usual warm smile was gone, replaced by a tightness around her mouth. "Michael, something isn't right," she said quietly, lowering her voice so Sophie wouldn't hear. She explained about the man at her door, about the hints and veiled threats. He felt a slow burn in his chest. Margaret had been there, anchored their lifeline. To see her shaken by the greed of men like Marcus, that struck something deep. That night, after Sophie was asleep, Daniel sat at the kitchen table, head in his hands. He could handle hardship for himself, but when it reached into Sophie's world, the lives of neighbors who had become family, he knew he couldn't stay silent. Victoria, meanwhile, sat in her office with reports piling on her desk. Robert, her longtime advisor, placed yet another dossier in front of her. "Marcus has been moving through Riverside," he said gravely, "buying quietly, pressuring those who won't sell. It's more than business. He's tightening a noose around you, around them." Her mind flashed to Sophie's laughter, to Daniel's steady voice, to Margaret's gentle kindness. Riverside was no longer just a neighborhood. It was a place, tethered to her in ways that she hadn't expected. Now Marcus was using it as a weapon. Victoria leaned back, her gaze fixed on the city skyline. Marcus had always believed that power was about control, of money, of people, of fear. But this time she vowed he had underestimated her. This battle wasn't just about protecting an empire. It was about protecting lives. Marcus Bennett had declared war, and whether she liked it or not, Daniel, Sophie, and every resident of Riverside were now caught in the crossfire. For days Daniel tried to ignore the pull of it all. The rumors twisting around Hale Development, the quiet fear settling into Riverside, the memory of Margaret's trembling hands as she spoke about the man in the suit. He had always kept his world small, his concerns measured in Sophie's smiles, and whether the bills were paid on time. But now Marcus Bennett's shadow stretched across his very doorstep, and the choice to stay uninvolved no longer felt like an option. Victoria came to him one evening, not with corporate gloss or polished speeches, but with odd-up blueprints and a tired honesty in her eyes. "I can't fight this alone," she said softly. "Riverside matters to me, but it's your home, your neighbors, your daughter. I need someone who understands this place. Not just from the outside, but from the inside. Daniel had almost laughed. A sharp sound born from disbelief. You want me to be part of your world? I pour concrete, Victoria. I don't sit in boardrooms. But she had simply unfolded the plans. Across his small kitchen table. Right between Sophie's crayons and the half-mended stuffed rabbit. You've studied architecture once. I've seen your sketches. Daniel, you don't just build, you understand how spaces breathe. How they carry people's lives. That's what this project needs, if Riverside is going to survive Marcus' game. The words struck deeper than he expected. The part of himself he'd buried when Catherine left. The young man WHO once dreamed of designing buildings that gave back to communities. Stirred faintly in the quiet of that kitchen. With Sophie leaning on the table, eyes wide with Priya whispering, Daddy. You can help them. The decision was made before he even realized it. The days that followed drew him and Victoria into a reluctant partnership. At first it was tense, she was precise. Sharp every meeting, punctuated by deadlines and investor concerns. He was blunt, grounded. Unwilling to let business jargon ignore the human cost. But somewhere, between the arguments over design specs and the late-night reviews of resident requests, a rhythm began to form. Daniel found himself pointing out details. Wider hallways for elderly tenants. Communal spaces where children could play safely. Small touches that turned concrete into community. And instead of dismissing them, Victoria listened. She adjusted, adapted. Sometimes even smiled when his suggestions reminded her of values she had nearly forgotten. One evening Sophie burst into the office where they were reviewing layouts. Daddy, look, Victoria, I drew us a garden for the roof. She held up a crayon sketch of sunflowers, stretching toward the square. Victoria knelt down, her designer heels, clicking softly on the polished floor, and studied the drawing with the same respect she gave any blueprint. It's perfect, she told Sophie, her voice warm. Maybe we should add a real garden to the plans. Daniel watched the exchange, something tightening in his chest. He had expected Victoria to see his daughter as a distraction, a complication. Instead, she treated Sophie asked, though her voice mattered, like a partner at the table. The lines between work and family began to blur. They shared late-night coffee over stacks of drafts. But also laughter when Sophie demanded they build cardboard models together. They debated budgets fiercely, but then walked Sophie home from the park side by side. Their footsteps unconsciously falling in sync. Through it all, an unspoken bond grew. It wasn't grand gestures or sudden declarations. It was in the quiet respect that deepened, with each shared challenge, in the way Victoria's gaze lingered a moment longer. When Daniel explained a design choice, in the way his voice softened, whenever she bent down to listen to Sophie's endless ideas. Neither of them said the word for it, not yet. But both felt it stirring beneath the surface. In the fight to protect Riverside, something more fragile, more precious was being built between them. A foundation laid not of steel or glass but of trust. Of family. Of the possibility that two broken worlds might just find a way to fit together. By the time autumn rolled into Chicago, the battle for Riverside had become more than a business dispute. For Victoria it was a test of everything she believed her company could stand for. For Daniel it was about defending the only place he and Sophie had left to call home. For Marcus Bennett it was a game of power. A game he thought he was winning. Whispers had already begun to ripple through the financial world. Articles spoke of delays at Grand Horizon, with shrinking investor confidence. None of it was true, but Victoria let the rumors spread unchecked. She knew Marcus too well. He thrived on weakness. If he smelled blood, he would come out from the shadows. That was exactly what she needed. The stage for the confrontation wasn't a boardroom or a courtroom. It was Riverside itself. A community celebration had been planned to unveil the first set of renovations. New windows gleaming in the afternoon sun. A courtyard filled with tables of food. Music echoing off brick walls that had once felt tired, but now buzzed with new life. To the residents it was a day of hope. To Victoria it was bait. Daniel stood beside her that afternoon, watching Sophie dot between neighbors with her face painted like a butterfly. His presence was steadying, an anchor in the swirl of anticipation. Victoria caught his eye for a moment, and in that glance was an unspoken promise. They were in this together. The crowd quieted when Victoria took the microphone. She spoke not like a CEO but like a neighbor, her voice carrying over the courtyard with warmth and conviction. Riverside isn't just a development project. It's families, it's stories, it's history. And no one, not even those who think power can be bought, will take that away. The words had barely settled when the disruption arrived. A sleek black car pulled up to the edge of the courtyard. Marcus stepped out perfectly tailored as always, his smile cold. Confident, he cut through the crowd as though he still owned the world, his eyes fixed on Victoria. "Well," he said smoothly, his voice loud enough for others to hear. "This is quite the distraction. Victoria, a little party to keep people happy while your empire crumbles." Gasps rippled through the residence. Daniel moved closer, his stance protective. But Victoria didn't flinch. Instead, she held Marcus' gaze. "Funny," she replied evenly. "Because what's crumbling isn't my company. It's your facade." At her signal, Robert stepped forward with a folder, handing copies of documents to city officials waiting discreetly in the crowd. Financial statements, property records, evidence of shell companies and falsified contracts, all tying back to Marcus. "You spread lies about Grand Horizon," Victoria continued, her voice steady as the crowd leaned in. "You tampered with materials, endangered lives, pressured residents to sell their homes. And you thought no one would trace it back to you." For a moment, Marcus's polished mask slipped. His eyes narrowed, his jaw tightened. "You can't prove." "Oh, but we can," Daniel cut in his deep voice. Carrying across the courtyard, he stepped forward holding up a small evidence bag. One of the cufflinks Marcus had left behind. The site of sabotage. Your arrogance left a trail. And now the people you tried to intimidate are ready to speak. Residents murmured in agreement. Margaret O'Connor, dignified despite her years, stepped forward from the crowd. "This man's people came to my door, tried to scare me into leaving my home. But Riverside isn't for sale." Applause broke out, raw and defiant. The momentum shifted like a tide. Detectives waiting at the edge of the courtyard moved in, their presence unmistakable. Marcus's composure faltered completely now. His smile was gone, replaced by a sharp edge of panic. "This isn't over," he hissed under his breath. But the words rang hollow against the chorus of voices rising around him. Victoria lowered the microphone, her heart pounding. She hadn't needed to win over Wall Street. She had needed to win here in this courtyard, among the very people Marcus had tried to break. With Daniel at her side, she had done exactly that. For the first time in years, the power Marcus wielded so recklessly had slipped through his fingers. He was escorted away under the weight of investigation. Riverside stood stronger than ever. Rebuilt not just with bricks and contracts, but with courage, trust in a community that refused to be bought. When the dust of confrontation finally settled, Riverside began to breathe again. What had once felt like a neighborhood under siege slowly transformed into a place alive with possibility. The renovations that Victoria had promised were no longer drawings on a blueprint, but walls rebuilt with care. Windows that let in light, and hallways wide enough for neighbors to stop and talk without feeling rushed. The old bricks seemed to stand taller, as if proud of their survival. Children filled the courtyard first. Fresh paint on the playground glistened under the late afternoon sun, and the sound of laughter carried through the air, unrestrained and healing. Sophie was among them, her braids bouncing as she ran to the swings, shouting for Daniel to watch her. Margaret O'Connor sat nearby on a sturdy new bench, her cane resting beside her, a smile tugging at her lips as she watched the children play. For the first time in years, she looked not worried but at peace. The rooftop garden became the soul of the community. Rows of flowers, herbs and vegetables turned the once empty, concrete space into a sanctuary. Sophie proudly showed off the sunflower patch she and Victoria had planted together, pointing to stalks already stretching toward the sky. "They're taller than me now," she said with a giggle. Victoria knelt beside her, brushing soil from Sophie's hands, as if it were a badge of honor. Around them, neighbors tended to their own small plots, trading gardening tips and recipes, weaving connections stronger than any contract. For Daniel, the transformation was more than physical. Walking through Riverside, he felt a shift in spirit. Doors that had once stayed closed now stood open, with neighbors greeting one another, sharing meals, and planning events in the revitalized community room. What Marcus had tried to divide had instead been knit together tighter than ever. And at the center of it all was the trust that had grown between people. Ordinary families who had refused to be pushed aside. Victoria stood quietly one evening at the edge of the courtyard, watching the glow of string lights flicker across smiling faces. She had fought corporate battles before, but never one that mattered this deeply. Hale Development had weathered Marcus's sabotage, but Riverside's revival was a different kind of victory. It wasn't measured in profit margins or stock prices. It was measured in laughter echoing from balconies, in Margaret's relief at being able to stay in her home, in Sophie's wide-eyed pride when she pointed at her father and whispered, "He helped build this." Daniel joined her, a cup of coffee in his calloused hand, his gaze following the same path across the courtyard. "You did it," he said quietly. Victoria shook her head, a rare softness in her voice. "No, we did it. Riverside is standing because people believed it was worth saving." The simplicity of that truth lingered between them. This wasn't just about new apartments or polished buildings. It was about the dignity of staying rooted, about the strength that comes when compassion drives construction, as much as steel and stone. As Sophie ran toward them, face flushed with joy, Daniel felt something he hadn't known in years. A certainty that the world could be rebuilt, not just for survival but for hope. Victoria, watching him lift his daughter into his arms, realized that Riverside's rebirth, that was more than a project. It was proof that when faith and kindness take the lead, even the most broken places can rise again. When Riverside finally stood renewed, strong and alive again, Daniel thought perhaps his part in the story was complete. The buildings were safer, the neighbors were secure. Sophie had a garden to grow sunflowers in. Yet life has a way of surprising us, of giving more than we think we deserve. What had begun with a single act of rescue, a man pulling a stranger from twisted steel, was slowly unfolding into something much deeper. Something that could not be measured in brick or glass. In the quiet evenings, after long days of work and planning, Daniel and Victoria often found themselves side by side. Sometimes it was in the rooftop garden, watching Sophie chase fireflies as the city lights flickered beneath them. Other times it was in Daniel's modest kitchen, where the scent of coffee mixed with Sophie's crayons scattered across the table. Their conversations drifted between practical matters, deadlines, design notes, resident needs, and the unexpected, softer moments that revealed pieces of who they really were. There was no rush between them. Both had lived through fractures that left scars too deep to ignore. Victoria's marriage to Marcus had taught her how quickly love could be poisoned by ambition and pride. Daniel's years of raising Sophie alone had built walls of self-reliance that he wasn't ready to tear down lightly. So they chose to move slowly, like builders laying one brick at a time, careful not to repeat mistakes of the past. Sometimes the tenderness showed in small gestures. Victoria bringing Sophie's favorite strawberry muffins to their morning meetings. Daniel fixing a loose cabinet handle in Victoria's penthouse without being asked. Sophie, innocent and unfiltered, often did what words could not, slipping her small hand into Victoria's during walks, drawing pictures of three figures beneath a bright sun, labeling them Daddy, Sophie, and Victoria. One night after Sophie had gone to bed, Daniel and Victoria sat together on the balcony of his apartment. The city stretched before them, the Grand Horizon Tower glimmering in the distance. "You know," Daniel said quietly, "foundations aren't always about strength. Sometimes they're about resilience, how much weight they can bear without breaking." Victoria turned to him, her eyes catching the amber glow of the streetlights. "And you think we're building one?" "I think," Daniel replied, his voice steady, "that what started from broken pieces might be stronger than we realize." The silence that followed was not heavy but full. Two souls, allowing themselves to believe in something new. For Victoria, it was the first time in years she felt safe enough to imagine love without fear. For Daniel, it was the first time he allowed himself to see a future where Sophie's laughter was joined by another voice, the table steady and kind. When Sophie appeared at the doorway in her pajamas, clutching her stuffed rabbit, Victoria rose without hesitation, kneeling to meet her. "Can you tuck me in tonight?" Sophie asked shyly. Daniel watched, his heart caught in the simple truth of the moment, as Victoria nodded and followed the little girl into her room. Later, when she returned to the balcony, Daniel was still waiting. He didn't speak at first, only offered her a seat beside him. Their hands brushed lightly, then rested together, fingers intertwining as naturally as if it had always been so. What began as an accident, as chaos on a construction site, who had become the blueprint for something far greater. In Riverside's renewal, they had discovered more than safe walls and steady beams. They had found trust, I hope, and the courage to build a family out of loss. Sometimes the strongest structures are not the tallest towers, piercing the skyline, but the quiet bonds formed in the ruins, bonds rebuilt with care, with patience, with love, in the chaos of a collapsing construction site. Daniel Cole, a single father hardened by sacrifice, pulled Victoria Hale, a billionaire CEO, from the wreckage of her car without a second thought, only to vanish without seeking reward. Their story, set against the gritty backdrop of Chicago's Riverside, that reveals a profound truth. The most enduring foundations are built not on power or wealth, but on selfless acts of kindness. Daniel's quiet heroism, rooted in his devotion to his daughter Sophie, challenged Victoria's world of calculated deals, showing her that true strength lies in giving without expectation. As they fought together to save Riverside from the schemes of Victoria's vengeful their reluctant partnership blossomed into trust, deepened by Sophie's crayon-drawn dreams of family. This tale tugs at the heart, evoking awe at Daniel's unassuming courage and warmth at the community's defiance against greed. It teaches us that life's greatest victories are not in towering skyscrapers, but in the small, resilient bonds forged in crisis, through shared coffee, a child's laughter, or a hand extended in the rubble. We're reminded to look for the unsung heroes among us, those who act not for glory but because it's right, and to cherish the fragile, the beginnings of trust that can rebuild broken lives. Which moment stirred you most? Daniel's selfless rescue, or the rooftop garden where Sophie's sunflowers grew? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear how this story touched you. If tales of quiet courage and unexpected love inspire you, hit subscribe and join our community for more stories that remind us kindness can reshape the world. Your voice matters. Let's share these moments together.